Ah, yes, looks like it's time for my lab project. Let me just check the time here. Looks like I'm making great time already. So let's begin and see how far this degrades as I go on, and hope for no interruptions. We're going to begin with the decline and then rise of urban areas. Now, after the fall of the Roman Empire in 476, regions within Western Europe became more self sufficient and independent. Due to the collapse of the Roman Empire, there were fewer cities and less trade within Europe. Within 300 years or 300 years before the year 1000, there was a decline in urban areas due to invasions by Vikings and Muslim Arabs and Berbers. Over time, manors, nobles, and knights appeared. Around 750, agriculture began to thrive due to global warming, leading to a much larger population and a much of a growth in long distance trade. Urban areas began to rise, accompanied with the rise of the Roman Catholic Church, leading to a lot of Christian architecture, artwork, and ideas. Now, moving into patriarchy in Europe, due to the very complex urban culture in medieval Europe, males had dominance over women. Women were only allowed to work specific jobs such as silk weaving, hat making, tailoring, brewing, or training other female apprentices how to do the same jobs. Pretty much most clothing related stuff. Over time, nun independence was stripped, and women had more religious restrictions put on them too, preventing them from hearing confessions, preaching, and chanting the gospel. Males claimed that this was due to women's intellectual inferiority and also due to women's role as a sexual temptress. Now, moving into changes in art, architecture, and literature, many buildings and paintings were designed and created based around the religion of Christianity. The wealthy commissioned churches and paintings around Christianity, and Gothic styles in architecture began to appear around the 1100s. A lot of artwork and architecture was borrowed from Muslim civilizations and other nearby civilizations, which resulted in 3D paintings. Because before they borrowed the painting styles from the Muslims, they actually only painted in 2D. So that's where a lot of the great paintings came from. Moving into trade with Asia and Africa, due to the Crusades, Europe interacted with other cultures. They had a lot of interaction. Many Europeans came into contact with the Islamic world, which stimulated a demand for Asian goods and Islamic luxury goods. And due to them trading and talking, there were goods being traded, intellectual ideas and thoughts being shared, and new technology being exchanged between cultures. Moving into the influence of food, textiles, music, technology, etc. from the Islamic empires. Basically, there was a very large influence and cultural borrowing from the more advanced Islamic empire than the medieval Western Europe at the time. Europe sought for spices, silk, porcelain, and sugar as they assimilated various technological, intellectual, and cultural innovations. Some examples of these are the Europeans began using Islamic medical practices. They borrowed poetry and cavalry and courtly love from the Islamic Spain. They borrowed the foundation for European algebra from the Islamic world, and they brought in artwork ideas such as 3D painting, and they also brought in quilts from the Islamic empires. Moving into the Viking invasions. Now, in the 300 years preceding 1000, Europe was subject to repeated invasions from almost every direction. The Vikings invaded many coastal territories within Western Europe, some of which are Ireland, England, the Holy Roman Empire, France, and Poland. And they basically invaded the territories, asked for money, or they would start killing. And that's what happened. Moving into military service and recruitment, many people were recruited to fight in the Christian military due to the benefits gained by joining, such as the guarantee of going to heaven upon death and the forgiveness of all sins that were committed, which moves into the Crusades. The Crusades were mainly wars against Muslims by Christians in order to secure the Mediterranean and recapture Jerusalem. That's what the main and most popular Crusades were. They were started by Pope Urban II, who called for the First Crusade in the year 1095. People were inspired to go on crusades as they could get the Holy Land back from the Muslims, they could receive riches, they would get forgiveness of all of their sins, and any crusaders were guaranteed a free trip to heaven. So it was pretty popular around that time to join in the military and go out fighting. The authority of the Roman Catholic Church. So the Roman Catholic Church had a lot of authority over the people in medieval Europe. They owned a lot of land throughout Europe, which greatly contributed to their authority. The Roman Catholic Church was headed by the Pope, who had absolute authority over the people, and the majority of the European population was Christian, which also led to the rise of authority in the church, because most of the population would listen to what the church said. Spread of Christianity throughout Europe. Christianity was spread throughout Europe by many different kings and rulers who were Christian. It was spread in a whole lot of different diffusions. The one I'm going to talk about is hierarchical diffusion. They tried to convert various kings and lords into Christianity, which would then trickle downwards in the manors, converting everybody throughout the feudal system into Christianity. And an example, this is one of the ways that it spread throughout Europe, was one of the kings, Charlemagne, conquered all of Gaul and parts of Germany and Italy, which he killed all prisoners of war that refused to convert to Christianity, helping to further spread it throughout Europe. Moving into the life of a monk or a nun, monks and nuns within medieval Europe lived within monasteries, which were buildings in which people observed religious vows. Monks and nuns withdrew from traditional life and served as religious examples, spending their time copying down Greek and Roman manuscripts and cultivating the lands nearby. The Western European political fragmentation. Western Europe was highly local, fragmented, and a decentralized group of territories. Due to the fragmentation that occurred with the collapse of the Roman Empire in 476, which that's how it got fragmented, the Roman Empire collapsed and it just turned into a large collection of territories. There were frequent wars between these territories, leading to even further fragmentation, and the role of the military men were enhanced. People needed more militaries because of these frequent wars between each other, and that began the Gunpowder Revolution, which led to cannons and guns. The Magna Carta was the great charter issued by King John of England in 1215, which was an article declaring that the king and the government were bound by the same laws as other citizens in Europe, which were ideas that were actually in the modern U.S. Bill of Rights, such as the right to a free and speedy trial. And this led to preventing corruption within Europe. So some of the economic developments in Europe. Medieval Europe's economy began being highly agricultural based in the beginning, with little amounts of trade. After the Roman Empire collapsed, a lot of the trade networks kind of died out. Over time, the feudal system which was a large amount of self-sufficient manors with serfs, lords, nobles, and knights. They got a lot of money by selling off their crops. And then later, as we go into the High Middle Ages, Europe actually began trading with Asia and Africa, sparking new technologies and new economical advancements. There was a lot of cultural borrowing between each other, and there were a lot of goods sought after. The hierarchy of feudalism. So, feudalism was a social system in Europe. It existed in manors, which were very, very large houses with large amounts of land. Lords owned the estate and or manor and employed serfs, which were similar to slaves. They were not paid in money. What they did was they gave off agricultural labor in exchange for protection and shelter. And then next up in the line of the hierarchy were the knights or vassals, which provided protection for the manor in return for food and shelter. Then there was the lord, who owned the estate and provided shelter and food to all. And at the very top was the king, which was the guy who owned the land and gave the land to the lord in return for the lord's loyalty. In serfdom, so serfs were the people who lived on the estates and or manors that were bound under the feudal system to work on their lord's estate. They did agricultural work in exchange for shelter and protection. So moving into the medieval manor and its parts, the way that it was set up was you would have the big manor, which was the house, and surrounding the house would be multiple crops, sometimes a church. It would be kind of like a small civilization because you'd have a lot of people living there. So you'd have all the serfs working the crops, and they did a 3-field rotation, which is where they only grew crops on 2 fields at a time and had the 3rd field left for fallow. So there would be a lot of buildings. You'd have pasture lands, which is usually the 3rd crop field that's left open. You'd have the manor, which would be the big building where everybody would live in. Some had churches where you could go pray, and they all had agricultural lands surrounding them. So moving into land ownership and taxation, the serfs gave the majority of their production to the lords that owned the land, generating landowners lots of money, selling off the excess crops and other products. The kings tried to tax subjects directly and hired a small army to supplement the feudal forces. Now, for the individual topics, I decided to choose first one as the 100 Years' War. Which the 100 Years' War was a war that lasted from 1337 until 1453. It was a war that started due to a conflict between England and France. They fought over claims by the English kings to the French throne. The war ended when the English finally left France. The war led to the rise of nationalism in both France and England. And the last topic that I decided to do was the 3-field system, which was the agricultural system that was put in place at manors to help them grow more crops. And it was a system in which they would have 3 fields, and only 2 fields would actually be used for cultivation that would be growing crops on them in a season. 1 field would be barren and could be used as grazing land. The other 2 would be grown, so it was similar to a crop rotation. So every season they swapped out another field, and it helped to increase the food production.